Hey everybody, Chad Wesley Smith here for Juggernaut Training Systems and Juggernaut AI, bringing you the third and final installment in our step-by-step programming series. This one, we're going to be showing you how to design a deadlift program. So there's going to be stuff that I refer to in this video that I've gone a little bit deeper on in the previous videos on squat and bench. So make sure I'd go back and watch those first and then finish things up here with the deadlift. So first off, we're going to talk about volume. So how much training do you need to improve to, what is going to be overloading enough for you to get some progress, your MEV, minimum effective volume, and then what's going to be the most training that you can likely recover from in microcycle, and we're going to call that your MRV, your maximum recoverable volume. So when I'm referring to those numbers, I'm going to be talking about a number of sets within overloading parameters, and those overloading parameters are basically how heavy, so what intensity range, and for how many reps are you performing. So if I'm talking about 10 sets in hypertrophy, I'm referring to 10 sets within the hypertrophy overloading parameters. So for the deadlift, and we're adjusting these a little bit lift by lift. You'll notice the bench ones were on a bit higher intensity range. So for the deadlift, we're going to be looking at 50 to 75% for, we'll call it sets of 6 to 10 reps. Then for strength, 75 to 90% for sets of 2 to 6 reps. And then finally, in peaking, we're looking at lifts at 85% plus for sets of 1 to 3 reps. So whenever I'm referring to a number of sets within a given phase, that's what I'm talking about, is number of sets that fall within these parameters. And beyond that, we just have to use some common sense as far as if you're doing sets of 10 and you're doing them all at 75%, your MEV and MRV are going to be lower because each one of those sets would be so much more fatiguing. And then if you're on the other side of things, you're only doing 50%, but you're just doing it for sets of 6, you're going to be able to do a lot more sets. So as long as you have sort of a common sense distribution through those ranges, like 75% is going to be more like sets of 6 if you're doing multiple sets, 50% is going to be more like sets of 10 if you're doing multiple sets. So now that we've talked about what are the overloading parameters, what are typical ranges that we may fall within? So for hypertrophy and a deadlifter, a low volume deadlifter in hypertrophy is going to be doing probably 4 to 7 sets per week, while a high volume deadlifter in hypertrophy could be doing up to, let's call it 16 to 22 sets per week. A low volume lifter in strength, they're going to be about 3 to 5 sets a week. And a high volume lifter is going to be more like 10 to 16 sets per week. And finally, in peaking, our naturally lowest volume phase, a low volume lifter in peaking, doing just 1 to 3 sets per week. And a high volume lifter will be doing 6, maybe up to 10 sets per week. Now these are pretty big ranges, to go from someone who's only doing 4 sets a week all the way up to someone who's doing 22 sets a week. Huge range. So what is going to be right for you or the athletes that you're working with? And to know that, we have to think about what are individual differences. So scientific principles of strength training, principle number 7, what's pushing someone towards high volume or low volume? So things to consider with this, and that's for less volume and that's for more volume, are going to be gender. So men going to get less volume than women. Size, big lifters less than small lifters. Strength, super strong lifters going to get less volume than weaker lifters. Experience is a bit of a tricky one because right when a lifter starts out, they probably aren't capable because they don't have the special work capacity to handle much training. So as you go through your career, you're going to go from needing low volume to being able to handle more and more as you get in better shape to train, as you increase your special work capacity through the rest of your beginner phases, intermediate phases, maybe even into advanced phases. And that is considering a lot of things. I'm talking about beginner, intermediate, advanced, very advanced from just an experience standpoint, and but you're having to look kind of globally at all training experience rather than just specific powerlifting experience, as it's going to be very common that a lot of athletes are coming to powerlifting from whatever other sports prior. And you also need to consider their sport background. Like I was coming to powerlifting at age 23, but I had been lifting weights since I was 13 for track and field and for football, training for sports. And I'd even say training because I was in my backyard, tying myself to trees with bungee cords, doing resisted sprints at like age 8, that I'd been training for sports, probably since about age 8 when I started doing track and field. So when I say experience, and I'm talking about beginners, which is maybe 0 up to 3 years experience, intermediate from 3 to 6 years experience, advanced from 6 to 10, very advanced from 10 plus, and those numbers are malleable. I'm talking about total training experience, not just specific powerlifting experience. How much of something you count before that powerlifting time, I guess would depend on how relevant it is. And if it was like, well, you're 40 years old now and you're like, I played high school football, but I haven't done shit for the last 22 years. Yeah, I'm probably not going to take into account those 4 years of lifting for high school football and would probably just consider you a beginner at that point. Experience is going to be one in there, but it works a little bit differently because as you get more and more experienced, even though we'd generally be trending up, that you're needing more volume because you have a higher and higher work capacity. Now, as you're getting more experience, you're also probably getting older, and you're hopefully getting stronger. And those are both things that are going to tend to push you towards the lower side of experience. So on the age part of things, old is giving you less volume, young giving you more volume. But all these factors have to work together. Marissa just turned 46. Sorry to reveal that here on the internet. She just turned 46. But if I gave to her, to another 46-year-old, the programs that she was doing, they would probably get crushed by them because they don't have the length of total training history that she has, going from 7 years old gymnastics till 17, and then 17, 18 years of physique bodybuilding type of training, and then the powerlifting training on top of that. She had such a huge work capacity. So all of these things need to be considered. They all work together. Final individual difference we're going to talk about here is lifestyle. If you sleep badly, you have a low calorie diet, a hypocaloric diet, whether you're trying to cut weight or you just don't eat enough to support your training. If you have really high stress away from training, whether that's a physically demanding job or just a stressful lifestyle for whatever reason, those are all things that are going to affect your training a little bit in a unique way because of the negative hormone effects they're going to have for you. It's going to actually raise your MEV, your minimum effective volume, the amount of training you have to do to see some level of progress. Conversely, though, it's also going to lower your MRV because you're not getting the same good hormone effects and adaptation effects from a good night's sleep and a iso or hypercaloric diet and the anabolic effects of that. Now you have to do a little bit more training, but you can't do as much ultimately, so that becomes a little bit tricky. But lifestyle is the other thing to consider there. Final considerations to be made, and these are going to be unique to the deadlift, is your technique. If you're a sumo deadlifter, you can probably tolerate more volume than an equally qualified than yourself as a conventional deadlifter would be able to. Some weird body proportions aside, but generally you as a sumo deadlifter will be able to do more sets within these ranges than you as a conventional deadlifter would be. But body proportion also needs to be considered. If you kind of have a normal-ish body, and I don't know if that's a okay word to use these days, normal, but if you have arms that you can't either scratch your knee nor that's not a thing, or you can't reach into your own pockets. If you don't fall into one of those categories, so you're in normal length arm territory and your legs aren't up to here or torso is way down there, so you have pretty normal proportions, you don't need to worry about it. But if you have like great deadlifting proportions, long limbs with a small torso, then you can probably tolerate a little bit more volume in the deadlift and likely a little bit less in the squat and bench than someone who, they got these stubby bench press only arms and a really big torso and short legs, they're probably, their deadlift is going to be so inefficient. It's going to become much more demanding on like their low back because of the positions they have to grab the bar with their little nubs, like this. So all of those things can be factored in as well. So that's a look at our volume, things that, the ranges that we're going to operate in, the factors that are pushing our volume down or up. So staying with the theme of our first two videos, we've got our example athletes. We've got lifter A, who's 275 pound, 35-year-old guy, been lifting for 10, 12 years, very strong. Let's call him maybe like a 675 or 700 pound deadlifter. He's going to be, in the low range of these sets. So let's do hypertrophy in this video. So let's say lifter A needs 7 sets in hypertrophy, and lifter B, our 25-year-old female 125 pound class lifter who's been lifting for like 18 months and maybe deadlifts 250 in a range, they're going to be on the high side of this, and maybe more in the 18 to 20 sets. So if you want to learn more about finding your individualized volume or volume for your athletes, make sure you check out the Finding Your MRV video, which I'll link down below in the description. So next thing we want to talk about is frequency. So how often are you going to have exposures to deadlift and deadlift variations? In that, we're going to consider overloading exposures, so things that fall within the overloading parameters we talked about before, or this could possibly even be underloading, like a technique session. And that is, if you've watched the other videos where we talk about these half sessions, that could be referring to just smaller sessions, so lower volume, lower intensity, choosing exercises that are self-limiting, or all the way to this, a technique session, which is going to be much lower intensity, like 30 to 60% for sets of 1 to 3 reps. So it's not overloading in any way, except it is giving you exposure to technique to satisfy the technical SRA curve. So with frequency, we're going to be looking at a range probably in the deadlift of 1 to 3 times per week. Yeah, I'd say 1 to 3 times per week is as far as it's going to go. Maybe even a half, let's call it half a time to 3 times per week. But typically, most programs I write, 95% of the Juggernaut AI users, they're probably falling in that 1.5 to 2.5 times per week. So we'll say typically 1.5 to 2.5 times per week. And other considerations could be made here, like a deadlift only or push pull, where the squat is extremely de-emphasized or non-existent, possibly in some cases. But I don't really want to talk about that because, well, honestly, that's not powerlifting. Powerlifting, squat, bench, and deadlift. So but to each their own. To each their own. So what is a half session? Like I said, half session could be a technique session. So that would be your competition style deadlift, but for very, very low intensity. In a technique session, I'd advise you to use the lowest weight that you can feel your technique at. And that's going to vary by lifter. The more experienced you are, the stronger you are, probably the more you can get out of less weight, because you'll just be a bit more in tune, a bit more mindful of how your technique feels. And let's say you've deadlifted 350 kilos, 771 pounds. You might be able to do a technique session with all the way down like 150 kilos, maybe 170 kilos, so 35, 40%, where a lifter who has their best deadlifts 200 kilos, like 440 pounds, they might need to use about the same weight, 150 kilos, higher percent of their max, because if the weight's too low, they might not be able to tell, oh, was I a little bit forward, was I a little bit backwards, did I get rounded a little bit off the floor? But as you are more and more experienced, you'll have a better feel for that. So what determines if you need lower frequency or higher frequency? A lot of those same factors, individual differences that we talked about when finding your volume, your MEV and MRV, are going to be the same things that determine if you are going to respond better to and need lower frequency training or higher frequency training. And strength is really going to play a big role here. If you're pulling huge weights, you're a 400 kilo deadlifter, even if you have a phenomenal body and build for the deadlift, which you probably do if you're pulling that heavy, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to handle that frequent of exposures to the high-end ranges of overloading, of those overloading parameters that we talked about in the first part of the video. So you're going to tend towards that lower side, and as you get extremely strong, you might even be on the outside of our typical range here, down to 1 time a week or half a time a week. You'd also probably have to be really experienced to make that work. I know like Konstantin Konstantinov's one of the best deadlifters of all time. He talked about just deadlifting every 14 days. You're not him. That's probably not going to work for you because your workouts aren't 840 for 4 and you haven't been deadlifting for 25 years with the most stable, precise technique possible that every time you do it, it's like riding a bike. So we have to consider a few different things here. We have to look at our muscular recovery and adaptation, our neural recovery and adaptation, and our technical recovery and adaptation. So this is going to be dealing with the idea of stimulus, recovery, adaptation, which is principle number 4 in the Scientific Principles of Strength Training. Refer to that whole playlist for more info on that, or the book, all that good stuff. But stimulus, recovery, adaptation is we basically have this happening. That's a graph. We're creating stimulus, we're training, that generates fatigue. Then you start to recover from that fatigue and adapt to the stimulus provided. As that starts to level off, then we're going to introduce another bout of stimulus, another training session. Fatigue is created, you have to recover and adapt from that. Ideal world, we're going to keep trending up like that for a long time. It's not going to work quite that simply because it's not just one factor that we have to consider. So if all we have to consider is the muscular effort of it, that may be how we look. Fatigue, recovery, adaptation, new stimulus, fatigue, recovery, adaptation. And that's all things being equal. All of our recovery, our diet is precise and consistent. Our sleep is precise and consistent. Our training volumes and intensities are all tracked a ton. But then we have other factors. This is how well your muscles and your joints, maybe are recovering from training, but your nervous system could be taking longer. Your nervous system might be, it's getting that same fatigue, it's getting that same stimulus, but it's taking in more fatigue from the training. The deadlift is notoriously fatiguing to the nervous system. So it might not be quite ready, recovered, and adapted in time for this stimulus right here. So what do we do? Well, I'll talk about the next factor, technique, because technique is going to have a shorter curve. So as we introduce that here, our dotted line could be our technique. So as it recovers and adapts, it's going to plateau, but at some point, if you had really infrequent training and you were trying to do the KK model and deadlift once every 2 weeks, because you heard about, that's what your favorite powerlifter does or whatever, you're reading articles that are talking about people who have been training for 20 years, but you've been training for 2 months, like, well, I want to do what they do. Their technique is much more stable. You need more frequent exposures. So if this gap between our black dots here was 10 days, let's say, a less experienced lifter is going to have this really short SRA curve for their technique, and their technique's going to start to fall off by the time they deadlift again, or at best it's going to stay flat. But we want to improve our technique, of course. So that's why we're dealing with these 3 different lines: muscular, fatigue, joints and tendons, neural, technique. That's where we can really start to manipulate our frequency for better long-term results and manipulate not having every session be identical. So if we're in a hypertrophy session, not every hypertrophy deadlift session is going to be 4 sets of 6 at 70%, and we're going to do that on Monday, and we're going to do it the next Monday and the next Monday. But because some of you may need more time for your neural recovery, some people are going to need more frequent exposure to the technique. That's when we're going to get into these multiple, bigger, smaller, some level of undulation, and why we typically are dealing with 1.5 to 2.5 sessions per week. So the way that this is going to practically end up looking for someone like lifter A, our 275-pound class, 700-pound deadlifter with 10, 15 years of experience, they're going to be on the lower side of this. Let's call it 1.5 times a week. And then lifter B, who's much less experienced, smaller, moving the weight a shorter distance, moving less weight over a shorter distance than lifter A, they're going to be on the high side of this. Maybe they could be a candidate even to go up to three times a week. In extreme cases, yeah, sure, I could see someone going 3.5 times per week, but so rarely have I ever written that. I don't even really want to advocate for it here. So lifter A, they're generating deeper, more neural fatigue, more muscular fatigue, but they're able to, because they've been lifting for so much longer, their technique is much more stable. So this technical SRA curve going to get stretched out a little bit, so that with their 1.5 sessions a week, they might have their primary session, they have 7 sets of deadlifts to spread out over the week. Their primary session might be 1 top set and 3 back down sets. And then they might have a secondary session later in the week. The half session we're referring to here might be a less overloading movement, maybe the RDL, and they're going to do the RDL for the rest of their 3 sets, but maybe a little bit lower relative intensity, and it's already an exercise that's not going to tolerate quite as much intensity as their competition deadlift from the floor. Or maybe for their main exercise, they're going to use something that's a little bit more self-limiting, like a deficit deadlift, so that on their secondary session, maybe they're doing competition deadlifts, but just controlling the intensity and working at the lower end of those overloading parameters. So more like 55% for sets of 6 rather than 65% for sets of 8 if it was a primary session. While lifter B with 2.5 sessions, they're probably going to have one that's their competition deadlift, of their 20 sets. So we're going to get like, 7, 8, probably 8 sets of work done for them in that primary session. Maybe a top set with 7 back down sets. A lot of ways that it could be approached. And then a secondary session, still a full 2. This is where I took care of number 1 in the frequency. Now we're going to number 2. And that session still using a big exercise that lends itself to overloading, and depending on their weak point, we'll talk a bit more about exercise selection in a minute. So let's say they're going to do block pulls in their second one, and then their third session where we're going to, they can't tolerate quite a full session, another session of deadlifts from the floor, so they need to choose something like a GHR or reverse hypers or RDLs, and we'll talk about what's more fatiguing between those in a minute. But they need exposure to a deadlift type of movement, things that use the deadlift muscles, because they are not able to generate enough fatigue from that single session to where everything can line up pretty well, and they can have these less frequent exposures because their technique in the deadlift will fall off too quickly. And it's very rare that all of the factors are going to line up effectively. So if we have someone like lifter B, as they deadlift here, let's call this session A, they're generating fatigue, they're recovering and adapting, they train again, and then the second session they're recovering, they're adapting. So maybe this session was on Monday, this session is on Wednesday, and then on Friday, maybe they're not even quite all the way recovered, but we put in that other half session so we can line up technical SRA better, but it's such a small session, it doesn't generate much fatigue. So then from Saturday and Sunday, they're still able to recover and adapt before we begin the cycle anew with that big Monday workout. So even though you might not be fully recovered, it doesn't mean that you can't train, because each aspect of recovery isn't happening all together. Each thing is kind of in its own vacuum. So we got to say, are we going to satisfy technical SRA even at the, not even detriment of like neural SRA, because if you manage the load of the session well, it's not going to introduce enough new neural fatigue that it's going to prevent them from being ready for the next big primary deadlift session. So now, sticking with our example, lifter A, 1.5 times per week, lifter B, 2.5 times per week on the frequency. So next we're going to talk a little bit about exercise selection, how we can use that as a fatigue management tool, and then sort of putting the whole week together. All right, so now that we've talked about frequency, and you can dive deeper in that with the Finding Your Frequency video and Principle of SRA videos, both of which I'll link down below. Now we can talk about exercise variation, and this is variation referring to both exercise selection and loading. So the first and most common way that we think about exercise variation is, competition deadlift, block pull, deficit deadlift, halting deadlift, so on and so forth. And those are great for addressing different weak points, and you can check out our best exercises to improve your deadlift video if you want to know more about that. But it can also be used to manage fatigue and avoid adaptive resistance as we get into more complex problems to solve with someone's program, and how we are able to get them the most work that they can tolerate and with the most possible improvement coming from it, but whilst not overloading any one aspect of their recovery too much that we are overreaching in a way that we're not planning for and leading to overtraining. So as we do that, and to learn more about this, again, refer to those best exercises to improve your deadlift, addressing weak points deadlift series, and then also your utilizing variation for fatigue management and directed adaptation versus adaptive resistance. But you've already watched all those because you've been following along with this series, and I've referred to all of those many times already. But that's going to help us manage direct fatigue from deadlifting. So like soreness in the low back, glutes, and hamstrings. But it's also going to be needed to mitigate systemic fatigue and avoid interrupting squat training, and to a lesser degree your bench training. But if your low back's really sore, and then you're also trying to get a good arch setup for your bench, deadlift and bench can interrupt each other. The neural fatigue is clearly systemic, and then obvious how squat and deadlift training are interacting with each other. And though you might be a great deadlifter, or much better than you are in the squat, and that makes you want to just deadlift, and who cares about the squat? If you want to make the biggest total possible, which is how you become the best powerlifter possible, everything's got to get its proper attention. So, for example, if we had an athlete, let's say that lifter B, which I erased their stuff, 7 sets, 1.5 times a week, and lifter B, 20 sets, sounds miserable, 2.5 times per week. Let's say lifter B in this situation is weak off of the floor. So for her 2.5 sets per week, we could be looking at comp deadlift as being one of them, halting deadlift as being a good tool for improving weakness off the floor, and deficit deadlift, kind of a classic for weakness off the floor. So if we've got our deadlift A, B, and C throughout the week, this is going to be comp, halting, deficit. So why don't we just do comp deadlift all the time? That's going to get into the issue of avoiding adaptive resistance. So if you were only going to train for one training cycle ever in your whole life, you're like, I have this one training cycle to deadlift as much as I possibly can. I know John Bros, who's a proponent of like Bulgarian style training, I think he used to use a story to this effect, like, if your family was captured by ninjas and they told you you have to squat 500 pounds in a month, what exercise would you do? Of course, you'd only squat, and you'd do it every day. But outside of this ninja scenario, we assume that you probably have more than one training cycle in your life to get strong. And so it's not all about getting the most out of this one at the detriment of longer term training cycles, because we want to avoid adaptive resistance. So that's part of the reason we're going to use a couple different deadlift variations. That's adaptive resistance of the nervous system, of the muscular systems, and of the mind, or just how engaged you are with training. Because if all you ever do are squat, bench, deadlift, competition exercises, I heard that specificity is king and that's all that matters, so I'm just doing singles, comp lifts only, you're gonna get really fucking bored. So I'd encourage you to avoid doing just the competition exercises, but getting some variations in like this, targeted at your specific weak points, that's gonna help you develop faster and be able to sustain effective training longer. Now, if lifter B was a bit more experienced, a little bit stronger, but still dealing with this same frequency, because this would probably really be more like a 3 time a week frequency than 2.5 times a week, we can manipulate these exercise variations for different levels of fatigue management. So this could be, if we're in our one training cycle to save your family from ninjas situation, yes, comp deadlift, comp deadlift, comp deadlift. Gonna have a ton of fatigue that gets generated with that. You get a little bit more advanced, you need a little bit more fatigue management, maybe higher stress for whatever reason, less recovery capacity. Maybe this turns into comp, halting, comp. You get a little bit stronger, a little bit more advanced farther along. Maybe this turns into comp, RDL, halting. A little bit more comp, dumbbell RDL, halting. A little bit more comp, nothing, halting. Comp, nothing technique deadlifts. There's so many small gradations we can create to fit more fatigue management into the plan. So how would our lifter be here in our hypertrophy phase doing 20 sets a week, 2.5, so 3 total exposures to the deadlift throughout the week? How would we set this up over the course of a training cycle? You know, we're looking at 3 weeks and then a deload. Lifter like this could be a good candidate for 4 weeks before a deload, maybe even 5 weeks before a deload. But for the sake of this example, we're going 3 weeks and then a deload. So week 1, our comp deadlift day. When I'm referring to these numbers of sets, when we're talking hypertrophy, what we're trying to overload in hypertrophy is the total volume. So we're going to try and build up to this 20 sets here in week 3. So, you know, a lot of ways they could do it. Maybe, you know, we could go 14, 17, 20, 16, 18, 20. Hard to say, but, you know, we'd want to look at both MEV numbers and MRV numbers for each phase. So we'll call 20 kind of maybe a MAV, maximum adaptive volume, that we're trying to train in that range. So we could go comp deadlift here. So we're going to go to 6 RM at 7 RPE, and then we're going to do 5 by 6 at 10 to 15% less. Then our secondary, our deadlift of the week, this halting session, is going to be 6 sets of 6 at 65 to 70%, more like straight sets. You could go up and down throughout it. This is really like you do the first set at 65% and you're like, oh, you know, that feels a little bit too easy for the day. Then you bump up a little bit, see how that feels. Maybe you do 2 sets at 65%, 2 sets at 67, 2 sets at 70. Maybe you go 60, 65, 67, 70, and then back down. The possibilities are not limitless, but there's quite a few, and none of them are really right or wrong. So now we're at 12 sets, and then here for the deficit deadlift, let's do 4 sets of 6 at 60%. So this is kind of staying with the theme of the half frequency, like a half session, where these A and B are significantly bigger sessions than this. And because for hypertrophy, we're trying to overload volume, we can do that by increasing intensity. We can do it by increasing the total number of sets, or we can do it by doing a little bit of each of those, which is my preferred way of doing it. Now here in week 2, we're going to stay 6 rep max, but now we're going to go up to 8.5 RPE. Probably keep the same number of back down sets because the top set's getting harder and the back down sets are going to get a little bit heavier because we're staying at the same percentage dropping down. Then here we could stay the same number of sets, increase the intensity a little bit, or we could increase the number of sets. Let's call it a 7 by 6. Could still increase the intensity a little bit because we're already dealing with a range. We'll stay with that range, see how the athlete feels. This week, maybe they were more at the high end of the range. This next week, maybe they're more at the low end of the range. Over the course of a bunch of training cycles, that's pretty much irrelevant. Then here on our deficit deadlift day, we could go, let's just call our plan will be 4 to 5 sets of 6 at 62.5%. So we're going a little bit heavier. We'll see how they feel in that session. We want to for sure get 4 sets done. If it seems like they feel good, we can do 5 sets, but do that keeping in mind that the next week you have your most important deadlift of the training cycle, 6 rep max at 10 RPE, dropping down, let's call it even 4 to 5 sets of 6 at 10 to 15% less. That went down just because the top set's going to be harder. You could still do the same amount where we kept, you know, a flat number of sets. The total tonnage of the day is still going up because the sets are heavier. Staying flat over here, but maybe a little bit heavier than the previous weeks. And then same idea with this. Let's call it 5 by 6, maybe up to 65%. Now, in the third deadlift session of the week, you know that I've got a deload coming up next week. I feel like I can do one more set. I can survive this one more set during the workout and kind of promote extra functional overreaching as we go into the week ahead. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you with these videos. Hopefully you watch them multiple times and can grasp them. I'm not just saying that as someone who makes YouTube videos, but you're probably gonna need to watch them multiple times to get a good grasp of it. I referred to a bunch of other videos throughout these as well. Go and watch them. if you are serious about understanding how to design powerlifting programs, these videos or step-by-step guides, they're a start. But there's so much more to it in those other videos I linked, as well as the powerlifting program design manual. Or if you're just like, Chad, I give up, I can't design my own program, you've confused me too much. Well, like they used to say in the commercials back in the day, there's an app for that. And in fact, it is the Juggernaut AI app, in which it takes all those factors that I talked about here and many more into account to design the smartest program for you. So you can just go ahead and do that and make all of our lives easier. So make sure, go back, watch the how to design a squat program, watch how to design a bench program, rewatch this deadlift program, watch all the other videos that I linked in it. Tons and tons of great information in those. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I do think that it's really good. So hopefully you learned something. If you got questions, leave them down in the comments. Visit juggernautai.app to get the smartest program for you. Try it for 2 weeks free. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel.